Well, I'll start with the importance of understanding who your regulators are. So it goes back to the polling question. Each of the organizations should have their primary regulators set out in their communications plan. And I'll also comment that it is quite challenging for global organizations to proactively engage with all their regulators because there are too many. When I first started in this space, there were very few regulators in this space. And fast forward today, when you think about all the regulators that touch your organization, it's practically impossible to proactively engage with all. Just in the U.S. alone, you have state AGs in every state who are involved in this space, not to mention all the federal regulators. So part of it is coming up with a global strategy of who are your primary regulators, and it may be you're being investigated by certain regulators, so you want to make sure that you're paying attention to potentially engaging with them proactively so they don't find out about it in the middle of investigating you about something else. But that global strategy becomes key, and part of that is in handling your incident is what's privileged and what's not. Because as I'm sure all of you know, the privilege is different depending on the jurisdiction within which you are sitting. And you might have a multi-jurisdiction incident, and in the US, we may be saying, okay, let's be really careful. Let's guard this privileged communications and this work product because we don't want that to be turned over to litigation counsel, and we'll talk about the proliferation of litigation, particularly in the US, and how that's coming over more into Europe. But the problem is the regulators maybe here don't recognize the same privilege as we recognize in the US. And I can also tell you that regulators talk to each other, and they all want what you're giving to other regulators. So in one particular incident that I handled for a very large organization that had a viral incident, the ICO and the FTC were speaking together about what they were getting from the organization. And we were claiming privilege with respect to the FTC. The ICO was not recognizing that, and so ultimately we had to turn over information to both regulators in order to make them feel like we were being forthcoming and not trying to hide something. So coming up with a global strategy on who you're dealing with reactively, who you're dealing with proactively, and how you're managing privilege, which also boils down to what is privileged and what is not, and what kind of reports are being developed. It used to be that very long, detailed privilege reports were developed out of significant incidents. Not so much anymore, because there are huge fights over those privilege reports now, and courts, at least in the US, are requiring companies to turn them over if they aren't very carefully managed within a very tight privilege protocol. So that goes to decisions that organizations have to make up front at the time, because privilege isn't retroactive, privilege isn't pixie dust, you don't get to sprinkle it and magically protect everything. It all needs to be developed up front. So both of you deal with multiple jurisdictions. How do you view the context of protecting information that is privileged